Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast.
My best songs were not written out of active clinical level suffering. They were written out of understanding the suffering that I'd gone through.
Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today in this music and mental health podcast, I had the honour of talking with musician, singer and songwriter William Fitzsimmons. Our topics, as usual, are creativity in music and their relation to mental health, with a focus on the challenges to well-being and creativity within the music industry. In a wide-ranging and lively discussion, topics covered included the relationship between severe mental health issues and addictions and creativity, or the myth of the tortured artist. Deep suffering as a normal part of life that provides stimulus and content for creative communication. The joyfulness of the creative process. That creativity is produced by time, experimentation and process, not magic. The role of egolessness and intrinsic motivation in creativity. The ways in which the culture of the music industry burns people out. The healthy drive for perfection, or the creative chase. The central role of intuition. Music as therapeutic pointing. And the centrality of communicating feelings and emotions in music. I really enjoyed this conversation and I hope you do too. So now I bring you William Fitzsimmons. All right, well, here I am with William Fitzsimmons, and I've been really looking forward to this conversation, William, and it's lovely to meet you.
It's good to meet you too, Chris. I've been looking forward to it as well.
Yeah, no, and yes, as one bald man talking to another, it's also nice. It's not normally my experience,
Yep.
so
Universality, right? We're
that's
not
right,
alone.
and
Yep.
we should have a good empathic connection.
Already do.
Now,
You're just the more handsome, skilled version of me. So I'm
oh, well,
enjoying
this is obvious. It almost doesn't need saying,
right,
William.
right.
But no, it's lovely. It's lovely to meet you. And there's so many things that we can potentially talk about. And I think we share interests. There's a lot of overlap. You were a trained and practicing a therapist and counsellor with a master's degree, and obviously I'm a psychologist. Less known is that I'm actually a pretty keen classical guitarist and have had some performing history, but nothing like yours. But also that my doctoral studies were on the nature of creative insight, in particular looking at what are the factors that encourage creativity and what are the factors that inhibit it. And I've done a lot of consulting in both the creative industries and beyond in the corporate environment around innovation and creativity. So, as I said, there are huge overlaps between you and I. And I think maybe a place to start, given that, is if it's okay with you, let's start with how you think about your human suffering and indeed your suffering and its relationship to your creative process. I'm sure you've given that quite a lot of thought.
Yeah, I've been obsessed with that for years, actually. Prior to us doing the podcast, we had a brief chat about that, and some of my heroes are Nick Drake, Elliott Smith, artists that were known to struggle with pretty severe mental illness, addiction issues, things like that. And I definitely came from that school of thought that suffering, and in particular like severe, clinical level mental health disorders, were kind of necessary in order to make, the tortured artist, right?
Yeah.
You can't make great art if you're not suffering to some degree. The thing I learned over time, at least for me, was suffering is universal, and I didn't need to do anything to bring upon more, especially me. I was bringing on enough pain on my own. Um, and two, it wasn't really aiding my creative process. It was certainly giving me topics, but as
Mm.
far as sitting down and writing what I would consider a great song, it wasn't really helpful. It was more of a thing of all I wanted to do was lay in bed if I was depressed, if I was getting
Yeah.
over a divorce or something like that.
Yeah.
My therapist actually asked me several years ago, she said, "Do you think you bring upon more pain in order to write more songs?"
Mm.
Uh, and I laughed and then I got really angry. But then the next week I came back and I said no. I thought about it. I think maybe at some point in my life I did do that.
Yeah.
I think I got old enough where I realized it's that life's too short. And my best songs were not written out of um, active clinical level suffering. They were written out of understanding the suffering that I'd gone through.
Yeah. There's so many jumping off points here. I've been
Sure.
restraining myself here. So,
You're good. You're a good practitioner.
but that's right.
Right.
But let's start with this distinction between the undoubted suffering that we experience as human beings, the universality of that,
Yeah.
and that we don't need to add to that in order to provide materials for creative output. There's
Yeah.
plenty of suffering in anyone's life, and if it hasn't arrived yet, don't worry, it will.
It's coming.
Uh,
Yeah. And that's not meant to
yeah,
be right. That's not meant to be overly dark. That's actually that
no,
beautiful thing to realize because then it actually gives you freedom. You don't have to fear the other shoe dropping. You
yeah,
just fully expect. They're like, I'm gonna have good moments, I'm gonna have hard moments. Anyways, that's been a helpful thing for me to actually accept. I mean, that's a lifelong acceptance. Probably there's, Buddhists work on that for their entire lifetimes, but that's been a
yes,
helpful thing. It's there, it's coming, and it doesn't have to be the boogeyman. It's just a part of life.
indeed, and a few things to say there as well. In that um, we need to distinguish creativity, the types of creativity, I guess, in that in your field, of course, in aesthetic creativity, artistic creativity, I think those negative emotions and experiences are more valuable as content.
Hmm. Agreed.
Whereas obviously in other fields, in engineering and in mathematics or whatever a person's occupation is, it's probably not going to be that helpful for them figuring out a
Right.
mathematical theorem or to play chess better or
Right.
teach kids better. Um, Beyond them having empathy for other people's suffering, but I do think in let's say the music industry, and so those obviously there are cases, Amy Winehouse, for
Sure.
or whoever we want to look at, Nick Cave, or like there's going to be cases where there are people who've had extreme suffering and they've created beautiful art.
Correct.
No question. But the real question is that necessary and is it representative? And the research, thankfully, is now clear that on average, that kind of clinical level suffering is a negative for creativity. That, in fact, they find no relationship. They find either no relationship to that with creativity or a negative relationship.
Right.
Right. So typically speaking, when people are depressed, like you say, they're in bed, they're not
Hmm.
creating.
Right.
Later, when they're getting better, they reflect on their experience,
Right.
and because they've had depth of experience, uh, they then use their, for example, songwriting or musical composition to give some expression to that. Is that the way that you think about it?
Yeah, and that therein lies the rub, because the experience without, however you want to put it, understanding it, unpacking it, um, debriefing, um, that to me is where if there is no magic. First of all, that's my own personal opinion on
Mm,
creativity. I
mm,
it feels like magic, and that's a
mm,
beautiful thing. But if there is magic, to me, it's in those moments when you are um, when you're actually taking time to unpack your experiences and understand what they mean for your life right now and for moving forward.
Mm.
That's when I've had what I like to think is maybe the most joyful creative moments. I don't know if it's been my best material, but
Mm.
when I look back on my first divorce, or I look back on my grandmother dying or my stepmother dying a couple years ago,
Mm.
um, it wasn't in those moments. When I get the phone call about my stepmom, I didn't pick up the guitar. That's psychotic. I mean, that would be, no,
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that. For someone that might be a very therapeutic thing to do. And it's very possible something great would come out of that. I don't want to deny that, but for me, and I think for a lot of my friends that are also writing songs, um, yeah, it's in those moments much later when you can look back and
Mm.
try to figure out what it means to you.
Yeah, there's a certain, meaning making, and then hopefully a sharing of the meaning.
Yeah,
So there's obviously a strong impulse in artistic creation that it's about communication and
right,
usually communication of feeling. The
right,
complexities of feeling.
right,
Yeah, so I mean that's very interesting, and so your practice is more it's subsequent to the suffering, as it were. It's like when it subsides somewhat, then the mind clears,
correct.
as it were. It gives you, which is interesting. I mean, again, the research indicates not only is there's not this necessary relationship between clinical suffering and
Mm.
creative output. There's a couple of more positive findings. You used a phrase there, something like there's no magic here, at least in the sense of that
Right,
process.
right,
And the evidence is very strong that the best predictor of creative output is how much we produce. In other
right,
words, it's so we can create a lot of rubbish,
right.
a lot of dross,
Yeah,
but then we recognise the gem
yeah.
within the dross. If it's a tortured metaphor, but I think you see what I'm
No,
getting
I,
at.
I agree completely. I've been giving guitar lessons to my neighbor's son just
Huh.
for fun and enjoyment. I've never done it before, actually. I never
Yeah.
gave lessons. He's a really lovely kid, and um, I I at one point I just told him, I said, this just comes down to sitting with the instrument. That's it. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
any artist that you love, any of these guys, you're like, I want to play this Metallica song or this John Mayer song. And those guys fell asleep with their guitars.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and for me, creativity it's the same thing. You Availability. It's just availability. You have to sit, whether it's at the piano or I mean, sometimes I'll just go on the front porch, and just
Yeah.
sit and it's not magical. And I love saying that because I think that gives people that want to be creative and want to find whatever avenue that is. My daughter, you can see my daughter's drafting table. She likes to
Yes.
draw. She's an artist, Um, her having that space to come in here in my studio and it's quiet and she can sit there, she has to give it the time. So for me, that's the biggest thing that nobody ever talks about. Um, you have to sit down and write, you know?
Yeah. And you're right, and you're right, and you're right. And
Yeah.
again, there's a few jumping off points there. For my doctoral thesis, which was on creative insight, the subject group were fiction writers. And so you're talking about writing and writing and writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a surprising finding for me, it's probably not surprising for writers, was that all of them, without exception, felt that the most creative part of the process was editing.
Interesting. Yeah.
Very often their first drafts, they were just getting words on a page, and there was maybe a theme or a central image, but the key thing was then going back and cutting back and cutting back. One of the writers does 16 drafts of this novel that would end up being an award-winning novel,
Right.
but 16 drafts, and it's a
Right.
thick book, you know. And it's almost like they begin to see things in what they wrote yesterday. Or they go, that part's good. And it's that sensitivity. And if there's any magic, it's in the recognition of that. Now, the other thing they said, and none of them were mystically minded, and this picks up on your thing about it's not magic. They were all pretty hard-headed. But almost every one of them, if not all of them actually, said something along the lines of, it feels, when it's really cooking, you know, when they're really in the flow, in the zone of writing, they all said something along the lines of, I feel like I'm a conduit for the work.
Yeah, your vessel.
A vessel, exactly. And they weren't saying it, it was not like they're saying it's being beamed into them from Mars, you know, like.
Sure, right. That there's a deity that's presenting, and again, not to get on anybody's beliefs, but for me, that's not really been the experience. I have woken up and I have, you know, dozens and dozens of voice memos on my phone from my bathroom upstairs that were recorded at 3 a.m. because I woke up and there was some stupid melody in my head and I went, and I'm sitting there humming, trying not to wake up my wife at the same time.
Yes.
And half the time I wake up and I make my coffee and I listen to it and I'm like, well, this is garbage. Or it's like, oh, I just rewrote Let It Be. But as you just said, but every once in a while, if I keep doing that, if I practice the discipline of that,
there's the diamond in the rough.
every once in a while, something will come. But it's only in making I'm lucky. I'm lucky that I have the time. I mean, I have 3 kids, so there's not a lot of time, but I do find I make time to come into the studio. And you know, you also have to be careful too, because some things don't like to be forced, you know.
Totally.
You take the mule out to the field and it just doesn't want to work that day. So, you know, but you give yourself the time and the space to do it. And the forgiveness, whenever younger people ask me about writing, I always tell them, don't worry about sounding dumb. That is that self, you know, third eye kind of thing that we often do. Oh, that line's stupid. Maybe it is. That's fine. Keep writing.
But it then leads to another line.
Yeah. And maybe the line's awesome.
Which might be the one you retain, but it's got you there. And
it's okay to be dumb. Like, it's okay to say something stupid.
That's I think another way of framing that is one of the central findings in my research around creative process in whatever field is a kind of egolessness, a kind of self-forgetting. And because as soon as self-concern enters the frame, the brain is colonized in service of self-defense.
Absolutely.
And it will run down the most used pathways very quickly of what we know already. And I can't remember who said this, but someone famous said that the enemy of creativity is what we know to be relevant.
Right.
You know, in other words, what we already know blocks.
Yep.
And the worst thing is to have that sort of self-consciousness and self-concern. So and this might lead us in a way, because you mentioned there, obviously you've had some sort of mentoring role, as if I can put this politely, as a more senior artist.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's fair. Let me look at me.
I.e. old. This might probably lead us into a discussion of some of the difficulties that artists, young artists might face, for example, in the music industry. And I've got a couple of things in mind. It's just generally this desire for fame.
Sure.
So having that as a sort of extrinsic motivator. And perhaps for the listener to distinguish that there's a real psychological difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic. And basically, intrinsic motivation is much healthier.
Yes.
Because it takes our attention off self and an anticipated audience, and we're engaged in what we're doing. Because we enjoy it.
Yes.
And when we're operating like that, we're much more likely to be continuously in the studio or productive and producing the masses of the volume that's required to get the occasional diamond. right? Whereas we burn ourselves out of worry and pressure when we're working extrinsically. And this is in any field. This doesn't have to be.
Sure.
So I guess where I'm leading with this is, do you have views? We know that the mental health statistics are pretty bad. They're appalling, really, in the music industry compared to the general population.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been around the traps for a while. Do you have some views about why that's so, why the circumstances are so dire?
Well, we talked a little bit about that
Yeah.
again, before in a previous chat. I think the culture of the music industry historically, and I think more so now. I mean, I wasn't around in the 50s or anything, but my kids say I was, but I think it's lent itself to burnout. Um,
Yeah.
it's lent itself to I think a relatively unhealthy amount of striving at the expense of physical health, relationships for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got two divorces. That doesn't, I wouldn't specifically relate that to the music business, but I
Uh,
also wouldn't remove that from being
yeah.
related to the music business at all.
So it might be a factor.
I think it most certainly is.
Yeah.
You're gone a lot. Yeah, substance use is very normalized.
Yes.
In this business, and it's multitudinous things. But at the end of the day, it's a very hard business that very few people have financial success at in the long term,
Yes.
and yet it's something that a lot of people want to do. So
Exactly.
that creates a real horrible bottleneck, and you have a lot of people that end up going right into that bottleneck, very excited and naive, not in a bad way, and they end up getting hurt. And I've seen that happen to many of my friends. And it's
Yeah.
look, life can be very cold as well, and this business does not. It doesn't do many favors.
Yes. Again, a lot of rich veins here, but a useful notion here is to think about what are called psychosocial factors. In researching a whole range of phenomena in psychology, there's been more of a move of latter years to not exclusively look at the qualities of the individual, but to see the environmental
The
effects.
system, yeah,
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 these psychosocial factors, and you mentioned a couple of them in passing there. There's sort of chronic financial insecurity, the working away from home, the working late at night, the drug and alcohol, but also this whole mythology about fame
yeah,
and as we were talking earlier about the tortured artist, it can lead, especially young people, which obviously is always young people coming into the industry, can lead them to, you know, extreme activities, if I put it
yeah.
that way,
Of course,
sexual and drug related, and but what's driving it underneath is this insecurity
hmm
about will I make it, and
right.
yeah, so and this is so, I don't know whether paradox is the right word, but because the research evidence is that creative process ultimately is very good for one's mental health. As we were talking about earlier, it can help us resolve.
Yep.
And listening to music is therapeutic. Like,
Absolutely,
so you have this sort of strange situation where you have those facts
yeah,
coupled with the undeniable negative facts about the industry.
yes,
And so this is where I think that the mentoring of people like yourself for younger people coming in is so important.
yeah,
One, because they would respect what you have to say, right? And it's born out of successful experience. Like, here's a pathway to do this, right?
right, right.
And I'm guessing here, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but part of that pathway is bloody hard work, as we would say in Australia.
Of course,
Like, yeah,
yeah, no different than anyone else. I think that's
yeah,
able to have any kind of longevity. in any career. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I think
Although
this is
people don't think it,
important.
people don't think it is. They think that you
I
work.
know there's magic, and you
Yeah, it's
just
a whole, and that's not to say that it's not fun. I Writing songs to me is there's nothing else like it. There's
yeah,
just there's that moment when I get a line, or I'm sitting at the piano, and God, when something pretty comes out, it's wonderful. It's just the most wonderful feeling in the world.
yeah,
It's all the other stuff that's really, really hard.
yeah. And this of course is what draws people to it. I mean, I think that ultimately to put up with all the shit, as it were,
Hmm.
to put up with the 99% perspiration for that
Yeah.
1% inspiration,
Yeah.
there's got to be a drive.
Hmm.
And the drive is that experience, I think. There's an addictive, a healthily addictive quality to it.
Yes. Yes. I will not stop until I write the most perfect, gut-wrenching thing. And the wonderful thing, the truth about it is I never will.
No, that's
I
right.
never will. And I know that, and I'm going to get up tomorrow morning and I'm going to try to do it again.
Yeah.
Because the chase, that chase is just, it's amazing. To me, it's no different. My wife and I are, she's a dancer, she's an entertainer, and so she understands performance and traveling and all those things.
Yeah.
And she's a very independent person and very different than previous partners. And I'm not saying anything negative about anyone. Um, but with her being independent, there's always this chase element of it that I fully understand that she's different than me
Mm.
and that I need to show up if I want to have intimacy with her. And to me, the creative process is the exact same. I know that I'll never completely be at one with this person in the same way I won't with the song, but man, is it fun to chase it.
Totally. And again, some interesting things there. I think, it, oddly enough, it made me think about the nature of happiness.
Hmm.
And obviously, you can imagine there's a huge amount of research on what is happiness and
Right.
how does one get more of it, as it were.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the consensus appears to be that happiness is a byproduct; it's not a goal, and that it's a byproduct of engaging in something,
Hmm.
i.e., having a sense of purpose that is meaningful,
Hmm.
and it's more of a so the happiness is more of a subsequent realization that I was happy,
Right.
right? And I think this is a very important finding.
Yep.
Happiness is not the goal per se, but it is what happens. For example, if people practice gratitude practices,
Hmm.
they haven't changed anything about their life, but when they practice that, they begin then to notice in the flow of living all the wonderful things that are around them,
Right.
and do you know what I mean? And happiness falls out of that. They're not seeking
Yeah.
happiness, and I think
Yes.
I think the artistic process is the same.
Absolutely. All we have,
Or
all we have is this present moment of awareness. That's
yeah, and the
all
and
we
the
have.
idea and the ideal is very important.
Sure.
And of course, being an ideal, it's never reachable, but
Right.
it's the same as science if you think about it.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Science is this sort of venture towards an ideal, and of course, Newtonian physics is supplanted by quantum physics,
Right. Right.
right? And quantum physics, no doubt, is going to be supplanted by a more comprehensive model.
Right.
Um,
We're just
and I,
removing untruths. That's all we're doing slowly. We're not actually finding perfect truth. We're just
yes, and
removing
I
the
think,
thing that's real.
and,
Yeah.
and I think with songwriting and music, in a sense, we're talking about aesthetic truths. We're
Hmm.
talking about what's true for people. What can I relate to that is real for me in my life,
Yes.
And these are very, very, very hard to articulate, of course, and typically they're articulated metaphorically.
Well, and you know it when you experience it, though.
Yes.
I mean, that to me is it's the that horrible definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I think that was Tipper Gore. Don't quote me on that,
Yeah, yeah,
but yeah,
yeah,
to me that's the thing. I remember having the experience of when my mother used to play James Taylor
yeah,
and hearing Fire and Rain as a young kid. What would I know about losing a romantic partner in a
yeah.
horrible tragedy? What would I have any understanding of that? And yet,
Yes,
I one of my most visceral memories from childhood is listening to that song and just feeling some kind of beautiful pain in it.
yes,
And I couldn't explain it. And and when I found out later what the song was actually about, it didn't make it any worse or any better. It was still the same beautiful
yeah,
experience of connection. I might have understood what he meant a little bit more, but ask a child if they understand what loss is. They do.
of course.
This is the way that we can connect is through those emotions, right? The words are very important, but the words are really just a conduit to the feelings. That to me is where the when
Yes.
it works because I'm saying something that's true and the listener feels their own version of that truth. That's all.
It's very interesting. Part of my research into creative process was very much about the primacy of emotion in navigating the sort of search space.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right. And this then brings into our discussion the role of intuition.
Yeah.
Intuition's a real thing, of course. It's not only confined to the female of the species,
Right.
but it is this sort of the way the brain is structured. Cognitively, we process the world first, relatively unconsciously, emotionally. Basically, is good, bad, safe, dangerous?
Hmm.
Should I approach or avoid?
Right.
And then that information is passed to the prefrontal cortex and the cortex generally for more conscious understanding. But so it's always coloured by these emotional appraisals
Right.
that are faster than prior to our conscious appraisals. And when we are in what one researcher has called a clue poor space,
Hmm.
right? In other words, we can't just calculate your way to an answer. These intuitive feelings are our best guide.
Hmm.
But the evidence is one should only trust the intuitive feelings of an expert. In other words, now we're back to that person who sits every day and is
Right.
drilling into their topic matter, their subject,
Right.
so that they're now unconsciously drawing all that data, all those data points.
Yes.
And emotions in that way are much more complex data points. They're so complex that it can take thousands and thousands of words to try to capture them, and they still imperfectly capture them.
Right. Sufjan Stevens said that, right? Words are futile devices.
There you go.
They just don't do it. They do beautiful. I mean, what's more beautiful than language? But they
Yes,
still don't do it. They don't tell the whole story. Yeah.
but they point. In
They
some
get us
Buddhist
in the right direction. Yeah.
yes, in some Buddhist practices, that the teachers provide what they call pointers, because you can't
Right.
give someone an experience,
Right.
but the magic or the skill is in the pointing, and I guess
Yeah.
that's another way of thinking about
Yeah.
the
Well, and that's how I tend to look at music like that. I used to think, and again, having been a therapist for
mm,
a short amount of time, but obviously keeping an interest in mental health all these years. My experience is that music for me, it's not curative. It doesn't actually heal anything. What it does is
yes,
like the pointers is that it helps reveal to me the the areas that need addressing. It's very similar to me with journaling. My therapist years ago got me into the practice of journaling. She said, "You have a lot of
yeah,
stuff there. Let's get it out." writing letters to people and not sending them, all these empty chair
Yes.
activity things that you understand well. And when I look at music, not just my own songs, but when I'm listening to a song, and I think about it like that, I'm not looking for this song to heal me, but if I start crying or there's some emotion that comes up, usually crying, there's something in there that needs addressing. The song can't fix it, but boy, does it help me figure out what needs to be looked at.
Yeah, and I think when we, I think a dimension of what you're talking about is finding meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
we can tolerate suffering when we find meaning in it,
Absolutely.
when we find purpose in it.
Absolutely.
And again, I know that in talking with my friend Terry McBride, who's the CEO of Network Music, he's always talked about this. I asked him once about what's the most important thing for him, about, well, why does he keep doing what he does? And he talks about music being about feeling.
Yeah.
And this is, and of course, if you think about human beings, we're mammals, warm-blooded, feeling-oriented creatures.
Yeah.
And we relate via these feelings of connection.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not sure exactly how long has passed, but I'm sure we've gone past our allotted time.
Sure.
And
Sure. You're welcome.
And I think the listeners would have a sense that maybe there could be a part 2 or a part 3 of this.
I would love it.
Where we might drill down on some topics. But for now, I just want to thank you so much. It's been a very rich discussion. It's been a great pleasure to meet you. I've been listening to your music this week, and really just, that you've got that sort of, what do they call it? The whisperer sort of tone,
I can put a baby to sleep like nobody else. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad
It's not a bad thing. Well, you didn't put me to sleep, but it definitely reflects exactly what we've been talking about, this way in which a mood and emotional tone can get you into a certain space where you can experience certain feelings with more clarity. So I warmly, recommend your music to people. It's beautiful, but it's also very significant and meaningful, and but not in a highfalutin way, in a very direct, practical way. So I recommend that to people. And again, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to our next conversation.
I can't wait. Thanks, Chris.
Fantastic. All right. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. And if you like the podcast, share it with people you like so they can like it too. I'll see you there. And the beautiful music you've been listening to is a song called Amsterdam by William.